In the last section, we spoke about how we're going to be making use of Nginx to serve up our application in a production environment. Again, we're doing this because that development server we're using is not going to be used in production. It's just not a production appropriate server. So let's talk about how we're going to get Nginx in here, first by taking a look at a quick diagram. Now, as a quick reminder, remember we already created a file called dockerfile.dev. The purpose of this file was to create an image that could be used in the development environment. We're now going to start working on a second Docker file. This second Docker file is going to make a second image that's going to run our application specifically in production. So the new Docker file that we're going to make is going to have a slightly different purpose and some different configuration inside of it than what we are currently doing inside of dockerfile.dev. All right, so I put together a diagram or two that kind of outlines what I kind of think we need to do here. All right, so I think that we probably need to use Node Alpine as a base because, again, we do have to run that npm run build command. In order to run npm run build, we're going to have to install all of our dependencies from the package.json file. It's just a hard requirement for building our application. So we'll copy over the package.json file, we'll install the dependencies, and then once we have those dependencies installed, we'll be able to execute npm run build. After running npm run build and generating our production assets, remember we already did that one time and it generated that build directory. So these are all the built production ready files right here. After we do all that, we'll then say, okay, time to start up the Nginx server and serve the result of that build directory. So that's the idea. But in this diagram, there's kind of two big issues I want to point out. Two big issues. The first big issue is tied to this install dependency step. The dependencies that we are installing only have to be installed because we are trying to build our application. If you recall a little bit ago when we initially installed all those dependencies when we first generated our app, that was 155 megabytes worth of dependencies. And those are only required when we're trying to build the application. After we actually build the application, dependencies no longer required. It is solely that build directory, so this thing right here, the index.html file and eventually the main.js files in there as well, that is the only output from the build step that we really care about. It's just that folder. And everything else inside of here, everything else inside of our code base is not required to run our application in a production environment. And so if we could avoid it, it would be really nice to avoid carrying around that 150 something megabytes worth of dependencies. The other big issue with this flow is the start Nginx step down here. So I said start Nginx, but yeah, pretty much what? Where is Nginx coming from? At what point in time did that get installed or configured or set up in any way, shape, or form? So it's clear that we've got a little bit of an issue here, not only with our dependencies, but also with the Nginx server setup as well. Now, I want to do a quick aside here. I want to open up Docker Hub, and I want to look up a repository on Docker Hub very quickly. So I'm going to open up a new tab, and I'm going to navigate to hub.docker.com. And then once here, you can find the Explorer tab at the top. And then you'll notice the second repository, it might change over time, so it might be higher or lower, is Nginx. If you click on that, you'll then see all the documentation for the Nginx repository and just the overall image. Now you can scroll down here just a little bit and see some documentation about what it is, and you'll also see some stuff about hosting simple content right here, which is essentially what you and I want to do. So it's clear that there is a Nginx image out there, and it can be probably used to host some simple static content. So it kind of seems like if you and I want to kind of start up Nginx or use this to host our application, it would be really nice to use that image inside of our Docker container. However, we already said we're using Node Alpine inside of our container because we have to get access to Node to install our dependencies. So essentially, it seems like we're in a situation right now where it would be really nice to be able to have two different base images. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So here's the plan. We're going to build a Docker file that has something called a multi-step build process. Inside this Docker file, we're going to have two different blocks of configuration. We're going to have one block of configuration to implement something that we're going to call the build phase. This build phase is going to have the sole purpose of using the Node Alpine image as a base, copying over the package.json file, installing dependencies, and then executing npm run build. And the result of all that is going to be that index.html, the main.js file, and essentially everything else inside this build directory right here that we need to serve up our application in a production environment. We're then going to also have a second block of configuration inside of our Docker file. When we put in a second block of configuration, we get the ability to specify a second base image. And so in this kind of run phase of our Docker file, we're going to use Nginx as the base image. Then, the next step after we specify using Nginx, we're going to essentially reach over from the run phase. We're going to reach over to the build phase and say, hey, out of everything that occurred during that build phase, we want to get that build directory, that build folder that has the index.html file and the main.js file and all that other stuff we care about. And we're going to take the result of all that, just that build directory, and we're going to copy it over to our build run phase. Now, when we copy it over to the run phase, everything else that occurred during that build phase, like the use of the Node Alpine image, the dependencies that we installed, all that additional stuff gets dropped out of the final result of our container. So when we just copy over just that build directory, everything else essentially gets marooned, it gets left behind, and we essentially are saying we don't care about anything else, we just care about that build folder. So then after we copy that directory over, we essentially start Nginx, and in this case, the startup is going to work because we are using Nginx as the base. So that's it. That's how we're going to solve this. We're going to use a multi-step build process for our Docker container. So let's take a quick pause right here. And in the next section, we'll start writing out the Docker file to make all this stuff happen. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute.